The Nun and the Peasant, a love that bloomed in silence. Sister Catherine's hands trembled as she watched the young woman collapse in the convent garden, her worn dress stained with mud and blood, her face gaunt from weeks of hunger and desperation. In that single moment, as their eyes met across the rows of winter vegetables, something shifted in the nun's carefully ordered world, a crack in the foundation of everything she had. Built over 15 years of devotion, prayer, and absolute obedience, the peasant woman's lips moved soundlessly, forming words that Catherine couldn't hear but somehow understood with a clarity that terrified her. "Help me, please, don't let me die here." And Catherine knew, with the certainty that comes from somewhere beyond logic or faith, that saving this stranger would cost her everything she had ever known, yet refusing would destroy something far more precious than her vows. If you believe that love can exist in the most unexpected places, that kindness can transform even the most rigid hearts, and that everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe to my channel name. Your support helps us bring more stories of courage and compassion to the world. Catherine had entered the convent of the Sacred Heart when she was barely 17, fleeing a world that had never made sense to her. The daughter of a wealthy merchant, she had been expected to marry, to bear children, to manage a household with the same efficiency her mother had demonstrated. But Catherine had felt hollow at every social gathering, disconnected during every conversation about potential suitors. The convent offered something she craved desperately: purpose without pretense, structure without the suffocating expectations of womanhood as her society defined it. Within those stone walls she found peace in the rhythms of prayer, in the silence between vespers and matins, in the simple dignity of work done for God rather than for the approval of men. She became the gardener, tending the herbs and vegetables that fed the small community of nuns, her hands learning the language of soil and seed, her heart settling into a quiet contentment she had never imagined possible. The woman in the garden was named Marie, though Catherine wouldn't learn this for several days. She had been a farmer's daughter from a village ravaged by a brutal winter and the cruelty of landlords who demanded payment regardless of failed harvests. When her family could no longer feed themselves, Marie had been sent away, not out of malice, but out of a desperate hope that she might survive where they could not. She had walked for weeks stealing scraps, sleeping in abandoned barns, her body growing weaker with each passing day until she stumbled. Through the convent gates, drawn by some instinct toward sanctuary, Catherine carried her to the infirmary, calling for Mother Superior with an urgency that surprised even herself. As she laid Marie on the narrow bed, their hands touched, and Catherine felt something electric and terrifying course through her, a recognition that transcended the boundaries of stranger and savior. Over the weeks that followed, Catherine became Marie's caretaker. Mother Superior, a woman whose sternness masked a deep well of mercy, allowed the peasant girl to recover within the convent walls, with the understanding that she would leave once she regained her strength. Catherine brought her broth and bread, changed her bandages, sat beside her during the long nights when fever made Marie cry out in her sleep. At first, their interactions were purely practical, defined by the distance between nun and charity case. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Marie began to smile when Catherine entered the room, her eyes following the nun's movements with an attention that went beyond gratitude. Catherine found herself lingering longer than necessary, inventing reasons to check on her patient between scheduled visits, her pulse quickening at the sound of Marie's voice. They spoke in whispers during those quiet hours, sharing stories that neither had told another soul. Marie described her childhood in vivid detail, the feel of earth between her fingers during planting season, the taste of her mother's vegetable stew, the songs her father sang while mending fences. Catherine listened with an hunger she didn't fully understand, absorbing every detail of a life so different from her own cloistered existence. In return, she confessed truths she had never voiced aloud: her discomfort with the world beyond the convent, her relief at escaping a future that felt like a prison, her love for the garden that asked nothing of her but attention and care. Marie listened without judgment, her eyes reflecting an understanding that made Catherine feel truly seen for the first time in her life. The turning point came on a spring morning when Marie was finally strong enough to walk in the garden. Catherine guided her through the rows of emerging plants, explaining the properties of each herb, the timing of each vegetable's harvest. Marie's hand rested lightly on Catherine's arm for support, and the touch seemed to burn through the heavy fabric of the nun's habit. They stopped beside a bed of lavender, and Marie bent to inhale its fragrance, her face transformed by simple pleasure. When she looked up at Catherine, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that neither could name but both recognized with devastating clarity. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Marie's fingers tightened on her arm. For a suspended moment, the entire world narrowed to the space between their bodies, and Catherine understood with terrible certainty that she was standing at the edge of an abyss. Guilt consumed Catherine in the days that followed. She threw herself into prayer with renewed fervor, kneeling on the cold stone floor of the chapel until her knees ached, begging God to remove this sinful desire from her heart. She avoided the infirmary, sending other sisters with excuses about pressing work in the garden. But her absence only intensified the longing. She dreamed of Marie at night, not lustful dreams, but achingly tender visions of simply sitting together in silence, of hands intertwined, of a life lived outside the narrow confines of duty and expectation. She woke from these dreams with tears on her face, mourning something she had never possessed and could never have. Marie, for her part, seemed to wither without Catherine's presence. The other nuns reported that she barely touched her food, that she spent hours staring out the window toward the garden, that she wept quietly in the darkness. Mother Superior summoned Catherine to her chambers with a expression that suggested she saw far more than Catherine wished to reveal. The old woman spoke carefully, weighing each word. Marie's strength had returned sufficiently for her to leave, she explained. Arrangements had been made for her to work in a neighboring town, where she could build a new life. It was time for both of them to return to their proper paths. Catherine nodded, her face carefully blank, even as something inside her shattered beyond repair. The night before Marie's departure, Catherine broke her silence. She slipped into the infirmary after Compline, when the other sisters had retired to their cells. Marie was awake, sitting by the window, her profile illuminated by moonlight. She didn't turn when Catherine entered, but she spoke in a voice rough with unshed tears. She had been waiting, she said, hoping Catherine would come. They sat together without touching, the space between them charged with everything they couldn't say. Catherine tried to explain about her vows, about the life she had built, about the impossibility of what she felt. But Marie interrupted her gently, placing a finger against Catherine's lips in a gesture, so tender it broke through every defense the nun had constructed. Marie understood impossibility, she whispered. She had lived her entire life at the mercy of impossible circumstances, but understanding something was impossible didn't stop it from being true. What happened next occurred in a silence so profound it seemed to exist outside of time itself. Catherine reached for Marie's hand, lacing their fingers, together with a deliberation that acknowledged the significance of the gesture. They sat like that for hours, not speaking, not moving, simply existing in this stolen moment of connection. Catherine felt her carefully ordered world crumbling around her, and discovered that she didn't care. For the first time in 15 years, she felt fully alive, fully herself, no longer hiding behind the safety of ritual and routine. When dawn began to lighten the sky, they finally separated, but something fundamental had shifted. Catherine knew she was standing at a crossroads, and the path forward would require a courage she wasn't certain she possessed. The weeks after Marie's departure were the darkest of Catherine's life. She moved through her duties like a ghost, tending the garden with mechanical efficiency, her prayers empty, recitations devoid of feeling. Mother Superior watched her with concerned eyes but said nothing, perhaps understanding that some struggles must be wrestled with alone. Catherine had always believed that her love for God was sufficient, that her devotion to this cloistered life represented her truest self. But Marie's absence revealed the hollowness at the center of her existence. She had chosen the convent not out of genuine calling, but out of fear. Fear of a world that demanded she become someone she wasn't. Fear of desires she couldn't name. Fear of vulnerability and change. She had mistaken safety for purpose, isolation for peace. The decision, when it finally came, arrived not with dramatic revelation but with quiet certainty. Catherine woke one morning and simply knew what she had to do. She sought an audience with Mother Superior, her heart pounding but her voice steady. She spoke honestly for the first time, confessing not just her feelings for Marie, but the deeper truth about why she had come to the convent in the first place. She had been hiding, she admitted, using her vows as a shield against life itself. But she couldn't hide anymore. She had found something real, something worth the risk of stepping into uncertainty. She asked to be released from her vows. Mother Superior's response surprised her. The old woman smiled sadly and revealed that she had suspected as much from the beginning. Some women were called to this life, she explained, but others simply sought refuge from a world that didn't know what to do with them. There was no shame in leaving if Catherine had finally discovered where she truly belonged. The process would take time, but the door would not be locked against her. Catherine wept then, overwhelmed by grace she didn't feel she deserved. Finding Marie required determination and more courage than Catherine had known she possessed. She traveled to the town where Marie had been sent, asking questions, following fragments of information, driven by a certainty that transcended logic. When she finally found her, working in a bakery, her hands white with flour, her face thinner than Catherine remembered, the peasant woman's expression cycled through disbelief, hope, and finally a joy so pure it illuminated everything around her. They stood facing each other across the crowded shop, and Catherine said the words she had rehearsed 1,000 times. I left, I chose this, I choose you. If this story has touched your heart, if you believe that love deserves to exist in all its forms, and if you've ever had to choose between safety and truth, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your engagement helps stories like this reach others who need to know they're not alone. They built a life together slowly, carefully in a small cottage on the outskirts of town where questions weren't asked too persistently. Catherine used her knowledge of herbs to become a healer, while Marie's strength and practicality kept them fed and warm. They lived quietly, two women sharing a home in an arrangement that raised eyebrows but was ultimately tolerated, in a world where survival often required unconventional partnerships. But within the walls of their cottage, they created something extraordinary, a love that bloomed not in grand gestures or passionate declarations, but in the small silences between words, in hands finding each other in the darkness, in the simple miracle of being seen and accepted completely. Years later, when Catherine tended their garden in the early morning light, she would sometimes think about the convent and the woman she had been within those stone walls. She felt no regret, only gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. She had learned that true devotion wasn't found in the rigid structure of religious life, but in the courage to honor what was real and true, even when it defied every expectation. Love, she discovered, wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it bloomed in silence, in the space between breaths, in the choice to reach across an impossible divide toward another human soul. Please leave a comment below telling us, have you ever had to choose between what was expected of you and what your heart truly wanted? Your story might inspire someone else who's struggling with the same choice. The greatest act of faith Catherine came to understand wasn't blind obedience to rules written by others. It was the willingness to trust that love, in whatever form it took, was sacred enough to build a life upon, even when the whole world insisted otherwise.